ownership in America is actually um, home ownership in America is actually a major, part of the culture. But for some reason, people are waiting longer and longer, mainly because they're not able to get into the property ladder. That leads me to the next what's that? So one of the major, for me, in my own case, in my own understanding, one of the major issues here is income inequality. When you look at this graph showing on your screen right now, it's basically showing the relationship between home values and wages. You would see that prior to 1970, the prices of homes was pretty much equal and rising in tandem with wages. But around 1970 and the early 70s, you saw a dislocation where house prices started skyrocketing, but wages sort of stayed stagnant. If you look at it, if you extrapolate over 50 years, real wages adjusted for inflation have pretty much stayed the same. Meanwhile, house prices have really, really risen. And part of the reason and the effect of this is major income inequality, where the rich has gotten much richer, the poor and the working class have actually just sort of stayed the same. Meanwhile, costs of things have risen. It's a problem that is worldwide. It's not unique to us in Nigeria, right? Just that different regions of the world are suffering it in different ways. And one could go into the politics of it, talking about the abandonment of the gold standard in the US in the 70s, leading to, a lot of, speculation, financial speculation, increase in assets. And the other thing is that when you look at these house prices, the value of house prices rising, part of the reason why it rose like that is that if you look at the corresponding data, you would see that within the same period, especially in America, but all over the world, the rise of extremely high income people have also been very dramatic. The rise of billionaires, the rise of multimillionaires. And a lot of it is because the world had gone more towards a capitalist system where there's been a lot of efficiency that is driven by policy. When you look at trickle-down economics, where governments come up with policies that allow for capitalism to really permeate the system with the hope and the belief that the gains from that efficiency and the gains from lighter regulation would actually trickle down to more and more people, to the whole idea of the rising tide will lift all boats, right? However, some data suggests that with these efficiencies and the gains of these efficiencies have actually been captured, right, by, the companies and the corporations. When you see more stock buybacks, and when you see a lot of that money being captured by a few, what tends to happen is when people have so much money, for example, if let's say the average wage is 100,000 naira, and the average house is 1 million, and for some reason you have 100 million, you have so much money, you're not going to eat 100 million naira of food, or how many cars are you going to buy? What's the next best thing you're going to do? You're going to look for something to really absorb that value that you have and preserve it over time. And what happens is, if you have 100 million and houses are 10 million, even if someone increases the prices of their house to you and say, oh, pay me 15 or 20 million, you would pay. And with that excess liquidity, it has bid up the prices of assets, land, housing, minerals, stocks, industrials. And you would see the effect of that in the rising prices of the major assets that people covet. Now, when the next thing that I also look at, that I think is also part of the problem, is industrial dislocation. By industrial dislocation, I'm talking about the fact that when you look at how so many industries have been transformed by technology, by AI, by regulation all over the world. When you look at transportation with Uber, when you look at even food delivery, logistics, media, entertainment, news. However, our industry, which is construction and development, is still sort of, if someone, for instance, if a builder that used to build houses, that used to be a prolific architect, let's say a builder or an architect that was very prolific in the 1950s, right? Maybe someone that died in 1960. If that person were to come back into the system today, they might not really be, they will still be able to build a house. But if anybody who used to be a mechanic, a car mechanic in the 1960s, that died in the 60s were to come back today, they won't be able to really, figure out the average current car that you see today. And that, stasis where you've seen that a lot has changed in terms of the demand, the population, the number of people that want houses, right? And even the way people move around cities. A lot has changed in that, on the demand side, but on the supply side, right? How houses are built, the knowledge about building houses, the openness, for where people have to see different ways of doing housing. A lot of that hasn't changed. Coupled with the fact that when you have more people looking for things than the supply of that thing, the average cost of that material would rise. There are some estimates that say that one of the most valuable resources of the next decade will be sand. For those of us that live in Lagos, that understand Lagos, you would also, especially this group where a lot of us here are practitioners, if you look at the price inflation of beach sand or regular sand, filling sand, or even sand that you used to mix and do construction, if you look at the price inflation over the past, I wouldn't even say 4 years, over the past 3 years or 2 years, you would see that that is actually a major issue, right? Also, when you look at the current construction process, what it takes to build a single house. When you look on the site, many of us are very familiar with the term off-cuts, where even just to tile a room, if the size of the room is 20 square meters, better buy, 25 or 30 square meters to tile that place. That is already a percentage waste. In some cases, people talk about up to 30% waste, 30% waste, in building a regular home. And as populations continue to rise, the current way of home delivery or housing delivery is unsustainable. It's not sustainable in terms of pricing. It's not sustainable in terms of the earth, right? There's only a finite resource of sand, of cement, of limestone, of all those things that is present all around the world. Even if, it's abundant in some other place, the cost of moving it to where it's needed is also makes it an unsustainable way. And then the other thing is also a skill shortage. If we look in Lagos, you see that a lot of plasterers or POP installers, even carpenters, are dominated by, this person is from Cotonou or they are from Ghana. I'm not advocating for closed borders. I like globalization and open borders, but it is the same thing everywhere, right? Anybody that listens to American discourse will see that there is a major issue with supply of labor and immigration. It's the same thing in Europe. A lot of the gleaming skyscrapers we see in the Middle East, in Dubai, is being done by people from Southeast Asia. And as those economies continue to grow, the demand for the people that do this labor starts to increase. How are we preparing for all that? That is also a major driver of costs, and it's also a major driver for housing that is not affordable. Now, I'll talk about financial dislocation. We've spoken about the industrial side of things, but on the financial side of things, it's also a major issue because prices are very high, because land prices are high, because credit is more expensive to obtain today because the demand is much higher because of zoning for several reasons. You see that a lot of developers now focus on luxury housing. And the logic is simple. If the cost of land, one plot of land, went from 50 million to 500 million, but the density on that land went from one house or one dwelling unit per plot to maximum three dwelling units on that plot of land. What you would see is that when the developer does the numbers, if they build that house, they have to look at the basic cost of land as a function of the sales price. In many countries, in many professionals look at it and say, the land cost cannot be more than 15% of the sales price. That's if you're doing standard entry level or maybe mid-income housing. But when you're looking at maybe luxury housing, you can say, well, the land price can even be 20, 30% of construction costs. It doesn't matter. Because at the end, because the margins are so high, it will only be maybe 10% of, the sales price, right? And because of that, you see more developers and more practitioners in the system building luxury housing. If you look at Lekki right now, look at VI, Ikoyi, Ikeja GRA, even many locations that you may not necessarily consider luxury, you would see that the type of housing people build is as a result of the many balls, the many things that a developer has to juggle in that equation, right? When you look at the other thing is specific to us, to our location, is the lack of debt and lack of liquidity. And what I'm talking about when I speak about that is the fact that we do not have, if you look at the people buying, the demographic of the people buying homes is sort of the same because mortgage penetration is very, very low. In some cases, some estimates put it at 5% of all transactions are being, executed through mortgages, meaning that as much as wages have not risen, people do not have the vehicle to actually leverage homeownership. So it means that that market does not have enough debt. The second part of that is liquidity, in the sense that because the mortgage system is almost non-existent, when you buy that house and you have a problem, you cannot quickly sell that house. And because real estate is not necessarily a liquid asset, if there was a robust financial system, you could take a mortgage on the house, you could borrow against it, and you can move on, right? And when you look at that, you see that the participants of the market are concentrated, right? You have a few developers and you have a few buyers, right? And if you're even able to play in the market, the interest rates to get into the business is very, very high. So for the developer, it's very, very high. So the developer would hardly ever go, or the builder, the person trying to sell, will hardly ever go to the bank to get a loan to build a house. They would look for joint venture arrangements, off-plan sales, and things like that. And the borrowers that are trying to buy, looking at 25, 30, 32% interest, it has to be that it's only reserved for people working in blue chip companies. And even at that, they're looking at it as a way to just enter. They're looking at other means of paying off that property within a very short period of time. And the time it takes to go through that whole mortgage process, look for the funding, and get a project actually executed, right, adds to the cost of the house. We all know the whole thing about time is money, right? That is the financial side of things is a major impediment. Now, we go into the regulatory constraints. Lately, in the past few years, I would actually give it to, the Lagos State government that you've seen so many innovative ways where they're trying to, streamline processes, trying to have a record of developers who are the people that are actually within this industry, trying to sanitize it, clear up canals, and this is where you pay your taxes connected to this. However, there are still those delays, right? You still have that issue where to build maybe a single house, you have 6 or 7 different agencies that you have to liaise with. And for each of those agencies, you pay certain bills, right? And even after you pay those bills, there are so many other regulations that you have to go through. And whenever the regulation is complex, it leaves room for some level of abuse because it's complex. But when it's simple, you might see that people would comply a lot faster and people are willing to pay more for it. And when you also look at the different agencies doing different things, you might see that couldn't it have been better if I paid one person or one agency and not have, three or four different people come and check the quality of the house, check safety, someone checks fire, and it's so disjointed. It feels like you're talking to 6 or 7 different people. And that also links into weak property rights, right? And when I'm talking about weak property rights, I'm talking about the fact that if you're a practitioner within the industry, you would know that you'll be very conversant with, unfortunately so, with the whole idea of, oh, I paid to the wrong person. Oh, this person had to buy the land twice. Oh, they even did their search, but for some reason, something happened. They didn't have somebody else is claiming the land. Those things they don't necessarily need to happen in the 21st century. And when you have those complexities or you have these weak property rights, it affects leverage. It affects the presence of big institutional investors. It affects the presence of overseas capital flowing into the market. Because when someone is looking at a market, and yes, investing in Nigeria might give them, 20% return or 30% return, where, in their own local markets, what they are doing is basic, 3% or 4% or 5%, right? But when they look at, property rights, when they look at it and say that, man, I can easily just, if I have any issues, it's just to go to courts, the documents are straight and reliable, I know who to call, it's easy. Then going there, yes, the returns might be higher, but, if it's going to take me 4 or 5 years to go through the court system and I'm really not sure what will happen, I'd rather just stay with my bankable 5-6% than try to gamble with this 20-30%. It's an impediment. Then it leads me to land management. And on the land side of things, we would all agree that the highest rises in cost of inputs is on land. And maybe because the economy has seen a lot of inflation, so a lot of people go to land as an inflation hedge, right? But when you see land prices rising maybe 20%, 30% year on year, it actually has a major impact on house prices and rents. When you have, again, going back to the inequality side of things, when someone has all that money, they'll have to invest it somewhere. And when you have a lot of that speculative land banking, most of us have heard, oh, buy this land is close to Lekki Refinery, or buy this is close to this. All of that, contributes to the price inflation for land, which is a major, major input in the construction, in the housing equation that makes homes a little bit unaffordable. Again, these problems, we all know them. It doesn't mean that they don't exist or that they are intractable, but one could manage them. Then that's part one. Part two is basically to look at some of the lessons from my own perspective. I know, most of us know a lot of all these lessons and even more that I didn't cover here. But for want of time, I just condensed it. When we look at the lessons, from around the world, the first one, you look at social housing, right? Singapore is very big, with the Housing Development Board, where pretty much the city-state owns almost all land, and they have strict guidelines on where things are built and how things are built. The city is the biggest developer for housing, and the city subsidizes the price of housing. But they have an interesting mix where The city owns the land and gives out a 99-year lease, just like us in Nigeria. However, whenever you sell your property, let's say you buy a flat today at $100,000, and in 10 years you want to sell it and it's now worth $200,000. What happens is that because the city retains ownership of the land, the government will share the profits that you've made with you. The reason why they do that is because they own interest in the equity growth of that property, where they now take that profits they've made to keep developing more land, to keep building and repairing more things and creating more density. That way they build a dynamic system where you don't have only one group of people capturing the entire value and holding it over a long period of time, because the land they have is very limited. Then you also have the social housing in Vienna. Most of us know about the Scandinavian model where, the housing stock they have is really dominated by renters, where the city owns much of the housing that is in the city, that is in the country, and most people are renting. And they try, in as much as housing is very expensive, there are so many levers the government uses to keep housing slightly affordable, especially for people, for citizens and retirees. Then you also have the incremental housing in Chile. If you look at the bottom, the picture at the bottom, you see the house on the right has doors and windows and walls, and the one on the left, is halfway done. And the system that the Chileans use is where they build the house and they put some of the shell together to give you the critical areas. Maybe they put the parts that they cover will be the kitchen and the restroom and one room, and then they leave the other ones. So you that bought the house, over time you can now gradually put the other things together. Now this is more, you'll see more of this in maybe in the outer lane suburbs, in the rural areas. In downtowns where housing is, higher demand and there's more density, you might not see this. I would even say that we actually do a bit of that in Nigeria, where you see some major developers that build shell and people will now use their hands and do the interior finishes, right? Then in the US, much of the housing for entry level is governed by the Federal Housing Administration, where, for instance, for first-time buyers, whereas the average demand for a home buyer in the US is to put down 20% of the house price before they get a mortgage, you would see that, for instance, over in the US, if you're a first-time home buyer, and especially if you're below a certain income level, what you would see is that that person is putting down only 3.5% of the home price. So imagine buying a 100 million naira house, and the only thing you're putting down is 3.5%, 3.5 million. That helps push homeownership into the market, right? And there are so many other affordable housing requirements from the Housing and Urban Development, department in the US, where it also now helps to give some people even that 3.5%, the government gives them some of that money, but they have to make sure that they don't sell the house for a long period of time, right? Then we go into another lesson is production housing, right? And what do I mean by production housing? What I mean by production housing is a housing typology or building a system that is slightly different from the way we currently build houses, right? If you look at the way, for instance, if you look at the way people build cars today, right? Imagine that maybe we have 2 million car makers. If you want a car, you go and build your car yourself, build it yourself. Imagine the quality, the differences in quality. Imagine the costs of each car, because everybody's trying to build that car by themselves. But you've seen a gradual movement towards, people just, having standardized processes and controlled systems that looks at houses as a commodity, not necessarily as a do-it-yourself, all-be-all, type of thing. And there's that difference between process versus product. So for instance, if you look at the pictures I have up, the picture at the bottom speaks to 3D printed housing. There's a company in Texas, based out of Austin, Texas, that is called Icon, right? Icon tries to be like a leading developer of 3D printed houses. And pretty much what it is they come in, get a plot of land, they put in a machine, put in the mixes, you put in the sand and cement, they have their own grading. And within like maybe a week or within 3 days, they could print a whole house for you. The 3D printer just goes in layers and you have your house. It's more insulated. It's a lot less waste. You hardly see any waste material out there. Less inputs are needed, and the house is a lot more, like cost effective, right? Now, because it's new technology, you haven't seen that major cost differential, right? That is coming, right? That is a process where it's still sort of in situ, still on site. They still have to come to site and put it together, right? Now, product that is different is when you look at, there's a company called Temple Housing, right? It's based, I was privileged to do some work with them, a while back. It's based in the Netherlands, but they have a very good partnership and franchise in Nigeria that's over 10 years old. And what they do is they use shipping containers, right? But the thing is that they go the extra mile where sometimes when you look at the houses, Temple Housing will put together, in Lagos there, you won't even know. Someone will have to tell you that this is actually containers for you to know, because they use several insulation, technologies. They clad it, they, insulate it, and they beautify it. So it looks almost like a regular housing. It's a product. They could pretty much assemble it on site, but much of it could be done off-site, and then they just come and quickly they put it together and cover it, right? That's a product, right? And Temple Housing, they've done several things. They do everything from quick service restaurants to even apartments, low-rise apartment buildings, all in Lagos and other parts of Nigeria. And there's this other company called Boxable. Boxable came into limelight because it attracted Elon Musk, who made a major significant investment in it, right? And pretty much they produce the houses, in a factory and they just move it out, right? Then the other side in terms of lessons is digitization and simplification. We know that one of the biggest news in the past 5 to 10 years has been blockchain, Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies. The use cases for cryptocurrencies, especially when you look at real estate, land records, and all of that, is actually quite profound. If by our understanding of the blockchain, which is that, there is a decentralized ledger that is online, that for you to change anything on that ledger, on that blockchain, you have to disrupt what millions of people that are decentralized in so many other places are doing. It makes it one of the safest, clearest forms of record keeping, where for me to change something, I have to make sure that everybody is in on it with me to change it, right? And so that blockchain is the bedrock for a lot of cryptocurrencies, and it now has clear applications, right, with land registry. If the city puts up, land records on the blockchain, it makes it almost impossible for anybody to try to change it, because it's now decentralized and everybody's seeing it. And a lot of people have used it. If you look at Netherlands, even Dubai, they've sort of, Dubai land development, for those of us that might have experience with them, you would see that a lot of it is digitized. Even certain states in the US right now, like state of Tennessee, they've gradually started moving a lot of their records, right? Land records, building records online. Same thing if you look in Ghana, some other African countries, in Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda. Ghana has this bit land where it tries to basically digitize, land records, especially for the poor, and have a digital record that cannot be easily changed to enable the landowner, both in the rural areas and even urban areas, to be able to take a loan on it or at least hold it for their own property rights. And you can see that some of those examples are things that can be used everywhere else. Then when you look at real estate tokenization, if you look at the fact that the price of housing has gone up so much, you see situations where this house is 100 million. Maybe I by myself, one person cannot afford it, but maybe I have 3 other friends that we can come together and afford that house. Instead of sitting down and writing long contracts on how to do it, if we had a system that was digital, that we could see on our phones, that we could transfer ownership very quickly, that would allow us to own a fraction of one house, then it makes it a lot easier. And there are certain examples, again, in the Middle East, where people are doing this digitization, using this tokenization to own houses. So if that house is one Bitcoin and 10 people own a tenth of that Bitcoin, $10,000, then they own the house. And they use smart contracts to share the rents and share the responsibilities. It looks like the future for housing ownership, especially investment housing in different parts of the world. And it's something that we could learn. Then when you now look at, some of the lessons that we're also seeing are the disruptions. I know, everybody's planning Dirty December right now. And over the past few years, this whole Airbnb business is a big deal, where because of the rising house prices, if you look at the rents, it might take you 20 years to make your money back. But if you look at short-term rentals, you can make it in 5-6 years. So there's that push towards a lot of short-term rentals. Now, in many jurisdictions, it hasn't happened to us yet in Lagos, but in many jurisdictions around the world, it's an issue where so many landlords have moved existing homes onto, short-term rentals that local people that live in that city are finding it harder and harder to even rent, talk less of buying. And with people making a lot of noise about it, aided by some other lobbies from the hotel chains and all of that, you're starting to see more cities place a lot of bans, either outright bans or higher regulations and tightening the short-term rental housing market. The truth is that this will continue to happen, right? Even in Nigeria, you would see more and more over time as rent prices and house prices keep on going up. You see more and more people saying we can't afford to live in our city, and the government has to step in and do something, right? There are some other cities that have put in rent caps in California, in Oregon, in Washington, cities, in those states where they've said, okay, you cannot increase your rent by more than 10% year on year. The maximum, there are some places that say you can't increase your rent by more than 3%, whatever it is, right? And that helps to sort of is a form of rent control that sort of keeps things in check, and sort of manages supply. Now, there are arguments about is it effective or not, but that's a story for another day. Now, we're going to talk about proposed solutions. Now, these are my thoughts, right? They might not be necessarily the gold standard, but, we have different thoughts. And based on what I've seen, some of these solutions would actually, when we adapt it to our local environment, it could go a long way to help us manage some of these issues. For me, the guiding philosophy in terms of solutions is, I firmly believe that the government does not necessarily it is not the government's core responsibility to provide housing. Because with all the inefficiencies of government, it is really profound when it comes to housing provision, right? And affordable housing. What the government has an incredible lever to do is in incentives. By, being able to, pull the strings, right? And manage resources and manage incentives, it could push more housing into the market. Because for me, I believe that one major solution is to increase the supply of homes. by increasing the supply of homes and managing the financial side of things, where the government can take the value that is being accrued and push it more into supply, it would balance over time. It doesn't mean that you solve the housing crisis completely, but the rate of growth of that crisis would start becoming manageable, that people might get ahead of it over time. And so these solutions are broken into three places: incentives for people, incentives for developers, and incentives for investors. When you look at incentives for people, there are so many really good examples, like the new MRIF, scheme that is being, championed by the Ministry of Finance with some other developers in Nigeria, that tries to give, mortgage at really simple interest rates for people that can qualify. It's a very good step in the right direction, because if you have more institutions doing that, if you have more people joining, maybe to increase that budget from 250 billion to 1 trillion, and you have a lot more people involved in that process, you would see a lot more demand, at least and again, when you look at demand is not just Econ 101 will say that demand is about people that are willing and able to purchase a product. That ability is the key. All of us want to drive a Rolls Royce, but if you cannot buy that Rolls Royce, then really, Rolls Royce will not look at us as their market. And that is very, very important, to activate that latent demand that is there into active demand. Financing has to come in, and it has to come in fast, with very obvious benefits for everybody. When you look at if land administration is increasingly and speedily digitized, where you can sit in Los Angeles, in New York, in Maryland, in Dubai, in London, in the Philippines, and you want to buy a house in Ogombo, you can just go online, type in the particular number of that unit or that plot on one government website, and it give you all the information. This is the actual owner. These are the coordinates. This is where it is. If you can see, or even if it means that you have to pay 100,000 naira to get that information, that is inflow for the government, but that makes it a lot simpler. So it means that as a developer or someone that's trying to sell a house, if you're not within that government website, anybody that's trying to buy a house from you is taking a risk. That goes a long way. But to get people to get involved, developers to get involved in it, it has to be seen that it's easy for anybody to put in their information. It's easy to check it. It's easy to vet it. It's easy to put it up there. It makes it easier for a lot of people to have, interest in the system, to get involved. Then when you're looking at single family zoning, where you might look at certain places, certain highbrow areas, even these days, things are much better in Nigeria about it, but even abroad, but still some parts of our major cities, it doesn't make any sense that maybe houses are going for 400 million in a location, but the regulation is, you can only build 2 dwelling units in this place. It doesn't, like cities such as Lagos should actually, it might sound drastic, abolish single family zoning. It should be such that within anywhere in the city, you can build more than one house on a plot of land. As long as that plot of land is above 500 square meters, you can build more than one unit. As long as it's above 500 square meters, and as long as you can manage the setbacks, maybe 3 meters in front, 2 meters on the sides, it should be such that wherever, you don't necessarily even need an approval for that, you should know that I can do this, right? Then, when you have transit corridors, by transit corridors, I mean, imagine it's a different scale of the BRT lanes, right? When you look at roads like Admiralty Way, let's say Admiralty Way is a transit corridor, where you know that on Admiralty Way you have clear, clean 20, 30-seater buses with AC that will continually drive every 5 minutes on that road, has clean bus stops, on that road, and it feeds to the train that's probably going to be on Lekki Epe Expressway, and all major roads like Admiralty will have is a designated transit corridor. And the buses that will be there don't have to be built or supplied by the government. No, all the government needs to do is build a central platform. And the same way people buy cars and put it on Uber, you can invest in a bus and put it on that transit platform, right? That really connects all the major areas. And once you start putting that, you would see that transportation being easy, effective, efficient, safe, fast, starts to compete with the need for one to have their own personal vehicle. Now, it leads me to autonomous mobility. If you check Tesla, right, you see that Tesla has become like a leader in autonomous mobility. They did an ad earlier on in the year where someone bought a Tesla from the Austin Gigafactory, and the car delivered itself to the person's house 40 minutes away. They actually filmed it where the car drove itself from that lot to the person's house. A friend of mine bought a Tesla about 4 months ago, and they did not meet a single human being when they were taking that car. The app just told them this is where to go. They went there to a warehouse. They pressed their number, the gates opened. They pressed something on their phone, the car opened, they saw the keys, they activated it, they drove out. Now, Tesla is moving into, autonomous mobility, right? And Uber, for us to think about it, Uber is actually looking at itself as an autonomous vehicle company, but people really don't know. For over 10 years, they've been investing in autonomous mobility. They want to phase out drivers, right? How does that affect the built environment? What does that mean for that house you want to build in Ekate where they're requiring you to have 2 cars per unit? If you know that most of the people that will buy don't need cars anymore because they can stay in their house and order a car from a parking lot on Kunsela Drive. And that car, because they have a 300,000 Naira monthly charge, they are guaranteed 20 rides of 30 minutes. Something like that. How does that change the built environment? How does that change the need to have parking? 2 cars per unit or 1 car per unit, as the case may be. Those are incentives that we need to start thinking about and planning. When we're looking at the planning of the city and how people are building and number of cars required, we need to plan for these autonomous vehicles because they will come to our shores. Then when you look at incentives for developers, there has to be a minimum density regulation. So it's not just about saying don't build more than 1 house. There has to be again, let me go back to Admiralty. You say, is a street as important as this? You cannot build anything less than 4 stories. If you build less than 4 stories, we will treat you like the way people are being treated right now by building more than 4 units where they are told they should build 2 units. If you put situations or regulations like that, you see that people will compete and dump more housing projects on increased density. If you say things like any house that is under 45 square meters, you don't need a car. And if you really examine it, who is the person that is using a 45 square meter house? It might be a single person. It might be someone who's early in their career that doesn't necessarily either doesn't know how to drive or can't even afford a car. It might be someone that is renting. It might be someone that needs to be very close to work or entertainment. It might be a tourist. So if you have this regulation needing that person to own a car, needing that house to have a car space, that is something that you basically limited the number of units you can put on that particular lot. And when you look at land and tax incentives, there are examples. I put this development, Sawyer's Walk, here. Sawyer's Walk is a property that I toured in 2024, I think so. It's a luxury development project in Miami, Florida, where a couple of developers built about 478 of just under 500 homes, across 2 towers, and it's a mixed-use development project that's dominated by studios, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments with Targets, a bunch of other shops. It looks really nice. But guess what? When you look at their capital stack, by capital stack, I mean, the makeup of the funding they used to do the development. When you look at the capital stack, you see that up to 20% of the cost of developing that property came from government incentives. It was tax incentives, it was cash grants from the government, it was a lot of investment from different government entities, right? And government invested in this. And the unique agreement they had with the developers for this project is, okay, it's almost a majority of the homes that is being developed in this project would be kept as rentals for seniors, for people that have already retired. It will be kept as rentals for people that have already retired at a predetermined price, and a predetermined rent escalation every year. If those people are unable to pay, the government will pay up the difference. But what it did is that it gave these developers the needed cash injection to build this property. And then it gave the city some sort of guarantee that for the next 15 years, they know that they have about 500 units in this particular place that is reserved for people that have retired. That will be their responsibility. Such things are things that could be exported, that we could adopt some parts of it and adapt it to our local environment. Where if you're charging somebody 30 million naira for planning, and you tell that person will charge you 5 million for planning, if out of these 20 studios you're building, you give 4 units to the state government. Officially, the state government owns 4 of these units. And these units, the government will rent it out at a predetermined price that is low to government employees that are retired or people that are under a certain income bracket. But you, the developer, will still manage the property, you still do everything. If you charge service charge, government will still pay. But that money that we would have charged you to develop this place, we are converting it into equity to own some units here. It goes a long way to start changing the narrative where government still owns property, but it hasn't really spent a lot of money to earn it. And is keeping it in a land trust for the people, because the value of these things will rise over time. And the burden to the government to provide affordable housing will keep rising as values keep rising, right? You can also have expedited processing. If, let's say, someone is guaranteeing that I'm building these 20 two-bedroom apartments in Elason, but I'll make sure that 6 of them are not for short-term rentals. 6 of them will be rented out to people if they can do this, and the government is the one that will provide that criteria. If I do that, then ABC, or I will sell it to people at this income. Now I know that in our peculiar system, there are certain things that we have to be aware of. How would it work? Who would do it? How would it be managed? Would it be open to abuse? But at least we start that process, right? And you now go to incentives for investors. We know that the costs and the requirements to make these things happen is humongous. It's not something that you require, that you wait for government to come and do. It's a partnership that different people can do. But the thing is that there is so much money within the system in the hands of everyday people that could be channeled to situations and vehicles that create value. If you see the fact that whenever, let's say, MMM or any of these get-rich-quick schemes come into play, you hear that, they ran away with 3 billion naira or 40 billion naira of people's money. Where is all that money coming from? People are rushing into these things because people are looking for how to invest their money, right, in a system that is volatile and is unpredictable. There are examples like Fundrise, which is pretty much a platform that aggregates money. I think many of us might know about Fundrise. It aggregates money from different people, retail investors, for as low as $10. That people put money, and that money could be put inside a real estate investment trust, or it could be put behind a project. with certain returns, right? Sometimes not guaranteed. And Fundrise sort of, checks the developers that come into their platform to make sure that they meet certain quality in terms of experience, exposure, um, capacity, things like that. And they put it on the platform and they have some form of management system to make sure that people's funds are not really at high risk, right? There are so many people that want to be part of the real estate value chain, but they are not necessarily, they are either very busy or they look at it as very complex. If you have a proliferation of these types of, platforms in the country that has some input with the government, it helps a lot to create trust in the system and provide the necessary capital that is needed to make things work. If the government can do some sort of tax breaks for, let's say, a company that wants to come and build with, local materials in Nigeria, maybe some of these, you see more of all this styrofoam that is being used to do slabs. Imagine that a company like that will get a tax break saying, oh, from January 2026, where every transaction is levied, you will not be levied 5% because you're building an input that is really, really needed in our system that goes a long way. There's another company called Small Change. I met the CEO of that company like a year ago, where she basically, the whole idea is that they're trying to push capital to small developers. So they are not necessarily looking at big developers. They believe that the development and housing provision ecosystem has to be decentralized for it to be fair and valuable. It shouldn't be that in Lagos, you only have one or two major developers building 2,000 houses a year. The regular person, the young person that has dreams of being a developer and starts with 3-4 units should have places where they could raise financing to make this happen. That creates that value, right? It could also be situations where if you have 200,000 naira or 1 million naira that you want to put into an approved fund for that will go towards housing provision, right? You get, a certain interest from that is sort of arranged. So you have a pool of capital, retail capital investors targeted at developments that maybe the intermediary is the government or some quasi-government institutions that do certification for those developers. That is already a vehicle to pull in more funds into the system and get things working, right? These are pretty much some of the ideas. Now, where does the Nigerian Institute of Architects Lagos State Chapter come in? A lot of it is what you guys have already been doing before, right? And it comes in research, right? The kind of things that is happening now, where you're bringing in professionals to really do the research and really share it, consultation. If the NIA becomes like a consultant, which I know probably they already do, to developers, trying to help developers to decide, because they're already doing that in many ways. An architect is already telling you this is what you do, this, and it's almost like the architect is the unsung hero, of the development project. They do all the work, they come up with all the ideas, this is what you can put here, put there. But the name that you see on the property is that of the developer, right? Since they're already doing all of that, it's already part of the consultation that also sort of like takes government information, right? Government ideas, breaks it down, all the new regulations that are coming in and try to get developers to understand it. Then it now takes you into advocacy. That feedback loop has to go back the other way. Because the NIA is Lagos State Chapter is also a big organization that has a lot of legitimacy and has membership by government officials and is known by the government. It could be one of the number one, like influencers, taking feedback to the government and saying, see, look at what we're looking at in the system. If you look at win-win solutions, if you do this, look at what people are saying. Look at what the developers are saying. Look at what the buyers are saying. Look at what people want. You know, yes, they might be in different places, but because we are the experts, here's the middle ground solution. That is advocacy. And then implementation. Most architects are already involved in, in actual buildings already. And a lot of architects increasingly now build houses and sell themselves. The implementation of a lot of these ideas, right, also helps to create that difference. A lot of times when you drive around and see a building that was built by an architect developer, a lot of times you see the lines are much straighter. You might see that they found a way to have very high density, but still have be very livable. A lot of health and safety concerns, you will not necessarily see it. You might see bigger windows, higher ceilings, brighter lights. All those things makes it in such a way that you guys are the pace setters that is also helping to sanitize the system, right? And this concludes my presentation and my thoughts. I know we went over the time, but I'm open to questions and further discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very insightful and educative talk. We're very, I think the chairman would like to say something.
Thank you again, GS, for granting me this opportunity. Firstly, I want to just appreciate everyone for your time here. It's not the same thing if we have such a powerful speaker and nobody on the call, to listen. We have about 100 people in the call, and we're still recording on our Zoom link. So in case you missed a part, some people are in transit, I know, you can always go back to the Zoom, to the YouTube link, YouTube, and then watch it again at your convenience. But before we jump into the questions and contributions, which I know will most likely be very robust, I just like to appreciate the presence of some of our, elders and leaders in the industry that have taken time out to join us here. Architect Enyi Benebo, who is the past president of the Nigerian Civil Architects, immediate past president actually, is on the call. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and your presence on this call. I also like to thank Architect Wumi Agbaje, the PS Lagos State Government Architect is also here. Architect Adebayo Odusonya, is also here. Past schools of the Lagos State Chapter, Architect Abimbola Ajayi, past chairman of the Lagos State Chapter here present, Architect Abimbola Ajayi, Architect David Majekudumi, Architect Fitzgerald Umar. Thank you for your time, for being with us. I also like to especially thank Architect Titi Adeleye, also who is on the call with us. Thank you for your time. Members and staff of Lagos State Government, Architects Bolanle Olukare, Babatunde Yakub, Niyi Dasalu, thank you very much for your presence. I'm grateful, and before I go, I was also recognize the presence of Architect Bayo Adewakun, who is also here on the call alongside Architect Charles Maduka. Thank you all. Just in case I didn't mention, it's just me picking names out of the few attendants I can see. For those that I've not mentioned, thank you all for coming. Everyone is important, and please feel free to contribute and also ask your questions. We do this every month, so we'll be just before you start asking questions, just a few information. We're having induction for new members on Friday. It's happening at the Naval Dockyard, Hall 2 in Naval Dockyard, and that's quarterly dinner starts at 5. We're going to be expecting that all members that can make it to please come around to celebrate with our new inductees and, of course, to enjoy the quarterly dinner with Madam President and her team and the council members, that will be coming into Lagos for this historic event. Also, our next business meeting is next week, Thursday. I hope to see everyone here on this call at that meeting if you can. If you cannot, again, you can join us virtually. We'll be glad to have you, join us. At the same time, I'd like to announce that the Ikeja branch meeting too is coming up on Thursday in Ikeja. The invitation has been circulating, but if you need more details, you can reach out to us. And there's a CPDP, National CPDP, also coming up on Wednesday. That's tomorrow at 4 p.m. So you might want to also register to be part of that. Thank you very much, our distinguished speaker, Chukwudu Monike. When I read your bio, I knew we had to just drag you for us to just share a little into your insights and your research. So here we go. Question and answer time. General Secretary, over to you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Please, if you have your questions, you can raise up your hand or drop them in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. All right, guys. Please, anybody that has, I can see a comment by Raymond. Yeah, nice to hear from you again, Architect Raymond. Good to hear from you. Please, I'm open to the questions. If you have any questions, please you can speak, or you can speak to Madam Secretary, who will be able to maybe moderate.
Okay. I think I have someone, Oluwatoyin. Please, can you ask your question?
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Chukwudu. That was a very, very insightful presentation, very detailed and explicit. Yeah. Quick one. The question is in twofold. One question with two branches. You have really dealt on the topic, and then I believe most of us architects now will be seeing ourselves not only as architects but also double as a businessman, because this has been, reducing us in the building environment, building industry. So going to the question, all those places you mentioned, and then things are really working out there. I would like you to help us, maybe the nuggets of measures that have been put in place in those places, in terms of the way things are being done there, right from the implementation, the regulation, and then handling of the developers. You get what I'm saying? So that the state chapter, because we have various committee, to be precise, we have practicing committee, and you did mention the Lagos State chapter of the NIA, we are not relegated to the background. We have a voice by God's grace, so that we can push all these things, as a proposal to state government. And by so doing, government will see us as not just being, complacent, but they will see us as also partners in the development of the state. So by doing that, because you will agree with me that development and real estate business in Nigeria, in Lagos in particular, has been characterized with a lot of flaws, ranging from flagrant disobedience to building codes, building law, And then when it comes to the construction too, you see these people, they are mindful of making profit. I'm talking of the developers. So they want to cut corners. So by giving us this nugget, all these measures, we're able to put them together and then come up with proposal to state government, whereby all these things. So by so doing, they will see us coming from a business angle, not only a professional. That's on the first branch. Then the other branch is that, you know, in developed countries, no development goes on, is being executed without involvement of the professionals in the built environment. But what do we see here in Nigeria? You see, as developers, they don't even want to hear, architects or those in the building industry, because they see you as coming to, take very large sum of money from whatever they intend to pocket. But that shouldn't be the case. So how are those things being done over there? And then you help us to throw more light so that with all this, we can be able to equip ourselves. Because I must say that um, the housing business in Nigeria is so huge, we have not even scratched it. So with us at the helm of the affairs, at the forefront, I believe that when we put this together, government will definitely listen to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Twain. That was a very detailed question, and detailed and simple at the same time. And I will start by saying that when the whole built environment space is a multifaceted space, and it's also a very collaborative space where to get a house done you need several people, right? And we have to lead with that whole collaborative mindset, right? And it cannot be a situation where someone, it's like, oh, police and thief, for instance, who will catch these developers and whip them into shape, right? It has to be a collaborative process. And like you asked, we can, have certain examples. If you look at how do we get the NIA to be an integral part of things? Some of it is already even happening. It just has to do more with maybe enforcement. So for instance, and even the regulation, you might be surprised that the regulation might even be tougher in Nigeria than in many other places, right? So in many parts of the US, you can basically buy a plan, a development plan, like a design. You can just buy it, over the internet and just, go to the city and say, I want to build this. And if you meet certain, guidelines, they will just let you do it in many places, right? However, in Nigeria, given the way things are and given the complexity, the scale of the demand and, the enforcement that is needed, it has to be such, I think it's already even there, where you cannot submit, a plan for a house for approval without the seal of an architect, right? A registered architect that is there. But we can take it a step further and say, when LAPCA comes to take a look at the project, right? Amongst the list of professionals there, you have to see the supervising architect. Like in my own experience and in my own career, even when I've built one-bed apartments that is just ground plus one, I make sure that I pay the architect for supervision, because I'm like, oh, no, you're not going to leave me alone with this thing. You're the professional. So you've designed it, good. But in terms of implementation, I want you involved in the implementation. It might not necessarily mean that the architect is the one building for you, but if it's designed in such a way that the architect has to sign up for every major stage of work, because it is their own design, because you have situations where maybe an architect might design something where it says, each unit has to be minimum 80 square meters. These columns have to be here and there. and then maybe the person goes to sites and tries to save money and doesn't necessarily do what the architect has specified. But the architect specification was what was used to obtain building approval, right? But if you have it in such a way that for every major stage of work, the architect has to sign on. And if it's such a way that you also have some sort of base pricing that makes it transparent. So the supervision work should not be more than, say, 20% or 30% of the cost of the design work. But the supervision has to be limited to, or maybe do it in such a way that the architect is not required to go and stay on site, but the architect visits maybe once a month or once per stage. Those things, if let's say that is a requirement that goes into, let's say, the regulation, you see that what it does is that it gives the architect a say, a stronger say in the whole development process. That's one. And then it also it gives everybody a bit of comfort, because what the government is trying to do with that is basically decentralizing, a lot of its enforcement. Because if you know, as the architect, that your license is in jeopardy, for instance, if ABCD goes on site, if they tell you, bro, sign this thing, you say, let me see what you guys are doing that you're saying I should sign. So they sign it over. They sign it before it moves to the next stage, right? I've had situations where I've had a conversation with my architect. I'm like, I really need this density. And the guy will say, Chooks, if you need this density, I'll just exit that, just sign this document here saying that you have been absolved of this, right? And whenever I hear that, I'm like, no, you do it. So for me, in terms of best practices, right, adding the certified architects, right, people that have up-to-date membership, within that system is one major way. Another way is there's this thing that is in the US that is called an expediter, right? Or a plan permitter. There are some jurisdictions where, because it takes 6 months or 9 months to get a building permit, right? And because the city officials there are so many, there's so many houses that need to be built, but there's just only so few, city officials that go to do permits. What they now tend to do is they say, okay, we'll have a bunch of third-party certified permitters, right? That people pay, right? Instead of waiting 6 months to get my building permit, I'll go to this private practice that is permitted by state government to do my permits, right? It doesn't mean that person sits in the office, just does permits and doesn't file it with government. No, but you take your permits to that person, they'll look it through based on the guidelines, they stamp it, they do the permits, and then they file it with government, right? And it's an online process where there are certain guidelines that you feel while you're filing it. So even if it doesn't meet, it just knocks it up. But if you have, say, that sort of land permits thing, where the government now says, oh, for you to be an expedited permitter, let's say they might say we want to have 3,000 expedited permitters in the state of Lagos, but we must make sure that half of them are trained architects. That changes a lot, because it is now pushing the architecture profession because the architect is a generalist that understands almost every part of this. So if you have that within that space, it goes a long way to both create that value, but at the same time also helps the system work. So maybe with that, I hope I sort of dealt with that question a little bit.
Yeah, yes, thank you so much. We have another question here, which says, how can we as architects access more knowledge on development in order to bring more value to our businesses? And the second part is, what are the possibilities of collaborations with great people like yourself in putting development proposals forward to the government?
Okay. Thank you so much for that question. I will start with saying that on the first part, in terms of how can, architects, access more knowledge? First things first is, there's this podcast I listen to, like there's mainly business, and when they talk about knowledge, they say, oh, first place to go is YouTube University, right? There's so much knowledge online within free sources right now that really helps, to push information around, right? Um, if you look at, there's for several countries, there are premier institutions that actually gather people and push knowledge out within the built environment. In the US, one major source is uli.org, is Urban Land Institute, which is like the biggest collection of architects, builders, developers, investors, financiers, in the country. And the membership is open to people from around the world. If you pay their membership, you get a lot of the information that they push out, a lot of the research that they push out, and they normally have a convention every year, I think in November, in different cities in the US, where if you're a bona fide member, I think, don't quote me now, but for people coming from, overseas, they tend to, maybe if you want to come present, or if you want to come for their convention, they actually, where they can assist to try to get people to come and look at what's going on. And then they have a lot of learning resources online, right? There are so many organizations like that. And then one can also take a lot of, if you want to go even deeper, right? You can basically take a lot of courses online, even with universities, not necessarily just maybe buying the course. You could buy a small 5-week course, but you can also do an online course, or just travel for a few months, do all of those things. And then the second part of the question about how can one partner, I am definitely, I'm open to, conversations, collaborations, working with different people for us to push this industry forward. My email is there, and then I can also share my LinkedIn and my other information with the board, with Madam Secretary, and I'm open to having further conversations. I have an open book on that, open door policy on that.
Thank you very much. There's one more question. It says, given that land costs in Nigerian cities are a major barrier to housing, how can we address the psychological preference for land ownership over home ownership, especially among middle and low income earners, to encourage acceptance of flats and high density housing?
Okay, that's a really good question. I'm actually excited about that question. So, if you look at, many of us would remember, for those of us that are already older, middle-aged, you'll remember that in the 80s and early 90s, right? When you think about estates, the only people that that live in quote unquote gated estates, and maybe you hear about the Shell estates in Port Harcourt, or you hear about maybe First Time, or you hear about some government estate somewhere. Why? It was because land was very accessible. What people know about housing is you buy your land, it might take you 10 years, but you build your house. This year you do foundation, next year you do block, maybe you do decking, you move in there, stay for 5 years and gradually build it out. And gradually, what started happening is that people started, maybe because the expense started going higher, people started building houses where they build maybe they get land, they divide it into two, put 2 gates, and people will buy those houses. The land costs went up again. People started doing, okay, we'll do a semi-detached house. Then you saw it proliferate around Chevron and so many other places. Land costs went up again. People started doing terraces. As land cost is going up, if you look in the past 3-4 years, the developments you see especially along the Lekki axis, is dominated by flats, apartments. People were doing maisonettes, now apartments. The thing is that there is a natural conditioning based on economic realities that actually push for people to really start to accept that, okay, this is what the reality is right now. I need a home, I need to own something, and this is what I can afford, right? And then gradually also merged with the fact that people are looking at, say, the cost of running, or maybe the stress of having to live here and maintain this house and all of that. I can't deal with it. Let me just live close to where my children's school is or my work and all of that. I'll live in a flat. If God blesses me tomorrow and I have more money, I can go further out and buy more land and build something. Because also the ownership thing is a cultural thing, right? It will gradually take time, but as more and more people are adapting it, you see a lot more people being convinced. Because what you also see right now is that there are people, it's not uncommon to see a professional that is in their 50s that have worked for over 20 years, 30 years, in Lagos, but they still don't have any property of their own. They've been a professional, they've gone to school, they've worked hard, but they don't have that. When that person is looking at it and saying, maybe I need to make different decisions, that whole urge to own something starts to become apparent. I even believe that the future, especially in Lagos, is not even just on flats, but in smaller flats, 1-bedroom flats, 2-bedroom flats, studios. Because when you look at the demographic, you will see that about 60% of Nigeria's population, about 60 to 67% is under the age of 35. And then about, when you now break it down and look at Lagos, if you look at the population under the age of 25, is also very significant. And these people need spaces. They can't afford the massive big spaces. They want smaller spaces. What you would see there is that even if they can't afford to buy those houses, the opportunity will become increasingly apparent to investors to buy those smaller units and rent it out bespoke to people, to young people, to single people, to people who want to be closer to work. I believe that the answer is that gradually the market is generally moving there. That's one. And the second part of it is, if, again, look, don't crucify me by this answer that's coming up. I know given the climate, the tax climate that is coming up in the country, nobody wants to hear taxes anymore. But a lot of the housing, a lot of land, especially in our big cities, is actually being subsidized by the government to the people. If tax dollars or tax naira is being used to build the expressway, the regional road, the power lines and all of that, and the value of housing and land is rising because of its proximity to that infrastructure, then a portion of that value should be shared with everybody by the government putting incentives that allows for a dynamic and constantly moving system. And how do I explain? What do I mean by that? If you bought a house, if you bought land in Aja, for instance, 10 years ago for 6 million, and today is 60 million, and you know that there is a new school, foreign school that is coming around there, it will come in 4 years, but you don't do anything with your land. Maybe you bought 20 plots. All around you is being developed, but you're not doing anything. You want to hold and wait. And you're holding it to wait for a developer that you tell, oh, let's do a joint venture. I'll take 50-50 with you. Those things are causing problems. But the reason why a lot of people are able to do that, right, is because there is no penalty for hoarding and for land speculation. There is also, the incentives are not there for the person to think differently. And I'll give you an example. If there is an annual property tax that, that is maybe restricted to certain underutilized assets, right? Or on certain corridors or something like that, where, once, let's say within a 3-mile radius, that, a certain density is already there. Let's say every year the government just expands it and says, if you do not build more housing on this land, your property tax will go from 0.2% to 2% or to 3%. So yes, that house is now worth 60 million. But guess what? Annually, you owe the government 2 million naira or 3 million naira on that land. And next year is 4 million. You would see that the person has an incentive to start building, or at least to meet with someone that can build housing on that land. So the developer is not just coming there and having conversations. The developer is having a conversation knowing that the other party needs for housing to be on this land. If those legal situations are there, you are creating an incentive for every part of the value chain to have a reason to come to the negotiating table. And that is something that we just need to start unlocking the value on land, because land is a critical part. And you see a lot of developers that are frustrated. Sometimes you might see a project that is lagging or that hasn't been fully developed. And you might think that, oh, this greedy developer has run away with somebody's money or whatever. But it might be that the arrangement they signed up to ab initio does not necessarily work, where within the 18 months of doing that project, the cost of materials have doubled, right? However, the number of units the developer is going to get is already fixed. And the landowner that bought that thing 10 years ago is now making 3 times or 6 times what they put. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Nothing wrong with that at all. But there has to be some sort of nudge and incentive that makes every participant a willing participant. That's my response to that. Hope I tried with it a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, sorry, I know time has, we spent quite a long time here, but there's one question. I don't know, can you quickly unmute yourself and ask your question quickly in
All right.
just 30 seconds? Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Mr. Chukudum. There's been a very interesting presentation so far. I enjoyed a lot of it, personally, because affordable housing is something I've been talking about myself, especially on Twitter, to a lot of people. And because of that, I've even come up with something I call a sustainable housing template, or an initiative. I wanted to call it affordable housing, but you can't really get affordable housing. You can't do affordable housing as an individual. You need, like you've been saying, government incentive and assistance as well. So what I want to say is more of a contribution because of the caliber of people that we have here. Now, back to the topic of government intervention. I believe that government intervention is desperately needed for affordable housing, especially in a place like Lagos. When you look at the total landmass of Lagos, Lagos is about 3,100 square kilometer, and you have about a population of 17 million. That gives you a ratio of 8,000 plus per square kilometer. That's a lot to deal with. Right. So, and the last governor that did anything remotely close to an affordable housing initiative in Lagos was Jakonde. That's how many 10 years ago, and a lot of other people have come after him. So the government intervention is desperately needed in this affordable housing matter, in terms of subsidizing materials, in terms of building the units themselves as well, a lot of things like that. Then another thing I would like to look at is how would you advise, this is a question now, how would you advise, let's say, developers or anyone that wants to take advantage of the overspill of Lagos into Ogun State? You have parts of Ogun State like Opik, Mowe, Asheshe, even going into Kobape now because of this same overpopulation issue. So, and there are a lot of real estate companies coming up in these areas. right? So
Okay.
what do you have to say about that?
Thank you very much.
Okay, man, thank you so much for this, really good insights. And yes, I agree with you that the density is very high. I would even say that the population is that 17 million population is actually quite low, because I remember 2008 when I worked on the Lagos State advisory. There was an advisory committee from PwC where we sort of advised on housing and different sectors to Lagos State Government for Vision 2020. We were looking at the population at that time at between 15 million as at 2008, right? So I think that probably we might be looking at more like 25 to 30 million people now in Lagos. So the density is quite high. And yes, a lot of what you've said is, correct. I would also say that, if you look at the number of housing, where the government is really trying to build a lot of, housing units, both on the mainland and on the island, you see it, in the news every other day where there are a couple of units coming. The pace of those units cannot match the demand, right? So given that the pace of those units that are being delivered cannot match the demand, the incentives must be there for a multifaceted approach where there are so many people in the system that are building houses. I'll digress a little bit. When you guys have time, just go and check housing provision in Tokyo, right? Japan has been able to do something that is really unique, where they've been able to manage a very dense, highly desirable, land, constraints, right? In Tokyo, they're a very big city, and still being able to maintain house prices that have just been stable over the last 10 to 20 years is what they've been able to achieve is unthinkable. And part of the reason why they've been able to do that in Japan is that they look at houses the way we look at cars. They believe that you can knock down a house very quickly and build a new one. They believe that you can fit in as many houses as possible as long as you have the setbacks on a small lot. They don't look at houses with the certain level of permanence that we look at houses, right? So you see a very dynamic housing market that pushes a lot of housing into the system. If you look at a city like Houston, Texas, right? It is the one major city in the US that does not have any zoning. So within the downtown core, you see that housing is relatively more affordable. Houston is regarded as one of the most affordable big cities in the US. What is the reason? The reason is density. And not just density the type of density you might see in some Canadian cities like Vancouver, where you have a few 10 developers building 20 stories. No, it is multifaceted, decentralized density. Anybody can build a certain number of houses on any plot of land anywhere. And then you now say you cannot build less than a certain number. That really goes, a long way. And when you're looking at how can you now encourage that density to have that spillover, outside, I'm even surprised why, you haven't seen a lot of developers that will just follow the rail, the rail that goes to Ibadan, just go along that rail. If you go on that route, you see that a lot of Chinese investors have bought so much land and built a lot of factories along that axis. A lot of housing developers should actually take advantage of that. Given the fact that a lot of people now work from home, you have a strong creative economy. I believe that if you build it with the right incentives, people will come. If that estate is built with good security, with good access, the ambience is nice, it's priced affordably, and you market it that way. People are already coming from different parts of Ogun State to work in Lagos. So imagine now that you have more developers throwing in that density, knowing that the demand is not just in one place, but in many places, and it looks differently. I think that would also help. So thank you. That's my contribution to my response.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. We want to appreciate everyone for joining us for this CPDP. For people that have made comments, you can watch all of the CPDP seminars at our YouTube page. It's been posted on the forum. Once you go there, you can see all the previous ones we've had as well there. So thank you, and we look forward to having you at the next CPDP, and as previously mentioned, the quarterly dinner as well, coming up on Friday. Thank you all so much. Good evening.
Thank you.